They said it was a tradition. A man leading his wife through the market square, a rope around her neck, the crowd parting as if to make room for livestock. The rope was sometimes tied around the waist, sometimes the wrist, but most often the neck, because humiliation was part of the bargain. The husband would stop near the auction stand, raise his voice above the laughter, and declare his wife for sale. Sometimes he named a price. Sometimes the crowd decided it for him. The smell of sweat and ale filled the air. Coins clinked. People laughed, and a life was traded in plain daylight. England, they said, was civilized. But the markets told another story. In places like Birmingham, Stafford, and York, these auctions became Saturday entertainment. The law turned its head. Newspapers printed the results, as if reporting horse sales. A fine young woman, aged 22, sold for 1 shilling and a pint of porter. Some wives cried. Others stood silent, eyes fixed on the ground, waiting for the moment to be led away by another man. For many, it was an escape, a desperate attempt to flee a drunken husband or a violent home. For others, it was a sentence passed by the man who once promised to love them. The crowd never saw shame. They saw spectacle. Men brought their children to watch, teaching them what power looked like. Women whispered behind gloved hands, pretending not to imagine themselves in that rope. The laughter rolled like thunder through the square, washing over fear, over dignity, over anything that might have resembled love. Each cheer was another nail in the coffin of compassion. Records show it wasn't hidden. Local taverns hosted the events with auctioneers drinking between bids. Some towns even had designated spots, an old bridge, a cattle pen, a marketplace where generations had traded grain, wool, and now their wives. The customs became folklore, half remembered, half excused. It was their choice, some said. They wanted to be sold, but the truth was heavier. Poverty, pride, and patriarchy made the rope tighter than any hand could. Imagine the silence after the deal was done. The husband pocketing his coin, the new buyer taking her by the arm, the crowd dispersing, already searching for the next curiosity. What lingered was not applause, but the echo of footsteps, the faint sound of a woman walking away from the life she once knew. Centuries later, the records still whisper. The names of the sold, written in fading ink, read like ghosts calling through time. Their stories remind us that cruelty rarely dies, it only changes form. The markets are gone now, but the idea behind them never really left. It lingers in power, in control, in the quiet ways people still sell others for comfort, for pride, for the illusion of ownership. And when you walk through an old English square at night, when the wind moves through the cobblestones, some say you can still hear the faint ring of a coin falling for a life. They said not every woman was dragged there. Some walked to the auction on their own. Their faces were calm, their steps slow, as if the weight of choice was heavier than the rope itself. They were not fools. They knew the crowd would laugh, that men would shout numbers like they were betting on weather. But to them, it was still better than the silence of a locked door and a husband's hand raised after supper. In their eyes, being sold was not surrender, it was a trade for breath. In one old letter, written on yellowed paper, a woman named Mary Bateman describes the day she was sold. Her husband announced her worth as a pint of ale and a promise of less beating. She wrote that she stood there smiling, not from pride, but because crying would have made the crowd louder. When the man who bought her took her hand, she didn't resist. He was kind, she wrote. He did not pull the rope too hard. The words tremble with something that feels like mercy, but reads like survival. Another account tells of Sarah Penny, sold to a gentleman from London who paid £3 for her and vanished into the fog. No one ever saw her again. Her name surfaced years later in a police ledger next to a body found near the Thames. The description matched. No ring, no rope, just wrists marked as if bound too long. The ink on that report is faded, but the story never truly disappears. Around them, the auctions were dressed like fairs. There was laughter, music, sometimes even fiddlers playing near the stalls. Beer flowed, and the crowd swelled with a cruel kind of joy. Men toasted to bargains. Women pretended not to notice. The air reeked of sweat and mockery. Even the sky seemed to hang lower over those markets, as if the clouds themselves refused to watch. Some women wrote of moments when they tried to look past the crowd, to the hills or the church spire in the distance, anything to remind them the world was bigger than that square. One diary entry ends with the words, "I stood until I was seen," a line so quiet it feels like a scream. History remembers the men's names more easily than theirs. But in dusty journals and forgotten letters, the voices of the sold women whisper something larger than pain, a strange, unbroken will. They were inspected, priced, humiliated, and yet they endured. Their stories crawl out from the past like candlelight through cracks in stone, refusing to die, refusing to stay buried. And when you read their words aloud, the ink seems to move, as if they're still waiting to be heard, just once, before the hammer falls again. The records say the markets ended when the crowd went home, but that was never true. When the coins stopped clinking, and the laughter faded, other hands reached for the rope, quieter hands, wearing rings of gold. These were the shadow bidders. They did not stand among the farmers or drinkers. They watched from the edges, faces half hidden beneath top hats, eyes fixed on the women who looked too young, too desperate, too alone. When the final bid was called, and the crowd dispersed, they would step forward, papers ready, promises rehearsed. What they bought was not companionship, it was control. Court archives from 1847 mention a name whispered in scandal, Ellen Marr. She was 19, small with dark hair, sold in a town square in Lincolnshire. Her buyer was listed as a gentleman from London, offering £2 and a guarantee of better living. She left with him that evening. Her trail ended the same night. No record of arrival, no body found, only a letter discovered years later in a chest belonging to another woman, signed with Ellen's trembling hand. They said I was chosen, it reads, but I think I was marked. Historians later uncovered the name of the man and the network behind him. They called themselves the Brotherhood of Exchange, a secret circle of businessmen, magistrates and landowners who used the wife auction as a cover for something far darker. They trafficked women under false contracts to estates, colonies and private ships. Some were written into wills as companions. Others were erased entirely. One ledger found in an abandoned manor listed 22 names beside coded symbols, each symbol matching a port city. Beneath the last, the ink bled as if smeared by a trembling hand. The silence of the victims was not their choice. It was purchased, sealed by power and fear. Servants told stories of women who never left their rooms, of cries muffled through thick walls, of footsteps pacing all night. But no one spoke openly. To accuse a man of wealth was to risk ruin, and so the Brotherhood thrived, hidden in plain sight, protected by law and laughter. It's said that in some towns, the auctions stopped, not because the people grew moral, but because the buyers grew efficient. Why risk public spectacle when private trade was more profitable? The market became a symbol, an echo of something that continued behind curtains, behind closed doors, behind every polite smile at dinner tables where the same men raised toasts to decency. Ellen's letter ends with a final line, written in haste. If you find this, tell them I was here. Her handwriting fades into nothing, but her words linger like a breath in an empty room. Proof that the market's shadow stretched much further than the light ever reached. It began with a discovery. A small leather-bound ledger found in the damp archives of Derbyshire. The ink had faded to brown, the pages curled with age, but the words were still legible. On one page, the magistrate's careful handwriting lists the price of sheep, oxen and grain, and then between them, without pause or apology, the words appear: wife, age 26, Fare obedient, transferred for £2 and 1 goose. Each entry followed the same pattern: a transaction, a condition, a note on health. It was as if a human life had become no different than livestock, recorded with the same precision, the same indifference. The magistrate had been respected, even admired. His ledger wasn't secret, it was civic duty. In his eyes, the sale of a wife was not cruelty, but order. The system had no language for love, only ownership. What began as an act of humiliation had been codified into routine. The law didn't forbid it. The church didn't condemn it. Together they gave it shape, calling it transfer of union, as though a marriage could be moved like furniture from one man to another. Imagine the ceremony. The husband stands beside his wife, rope around her wrist, the buyer across from them holding a small pouch of coins. A local official reads a short blessing, calling it a renewal of promise. The coins fall, the rope changes hands, and the crowd cheers. The woman is no longer a wife. She is proof that possession can masquerade as morality. In some parishes, priests even recorded these exchanges in baptismal books, their ink sanctifying what should have been a sin. The reenactments show it clearly. The torchlight flickers. The husband's face is blank. The buyer's expression calm, almost businesslike. The woman's eyes are fixed on the ground. She doesn't cry. She just exhales, long and slow, like someone who already knows that her name will fade before the ink dries. Every coin dropped in the market was more than payment. It was confession. A small admission that love had failed, that power had won. The buyers called it practical. The sellers called it justice. The witnesses called it entertainment. But beneath all that noise, something else was being traded. A quiet, invisible currency made of shame. It clung to the hands that exchanged money, to the air that carried their laughter, to the ground where they stood. When historians read that ledger now, they say the paper smells faintly of smoke, as if touched by the memory of fire. Perhaps it's imagination, or perhaps it's something deeper, the lingering heat of a truth too long buried. Because in those pages, between the lines of trade and livestock, lies the price of something England never accounted for: its own soul. And as the last page turns, one question remains: when a nation learns to measure people by worth, how long before it forgets what they're worth at all? They came for the spectacle. Men in work coats, women with baskets, children clinging to their mothers' skirts. The marketplace filled before noon, the air thick with ale and laughter. They said it was harmless fun, a village tradition. But if you stood in the middle of the square and listened, really listened, the laughter had an edge. It wasn't joy, it was hunger. Illustrations from the time show banners fluttering, musicians playing fiddle tunes, beer stalls lined up beside the auction ring. The smell of roasted meat drifted over the crowd, as if to remind everyone that everything could be consumed. And at the center stood the wives, nervous, still, waiting to be displayed. Their faces became the day's entertainment, their pain another reason to cheer. Children sat on shoulders, clapping when bids rose. Coins flashed like sparks in the sun. The crowd was not only watching, they were feeding the ritual. They shouted suggestions, mocked the women's looks, laughed at their trembling voices. Some wagered privately on who would fetch the highest price, turning the auction into a sport. One newspaper clipping describes a man who sold his wife twice in one day, the first buyer too drunk to claim her, the second paying more out of amusement. The report ends with the line, "A lively crowd enjoyed the affair," but not everyone came for laughter. Among the crowds were faces that never smiled, strangers who followed the buyers home, who lingered near alleyways as dusk fell. Parish records mention women who vanished days after the auctions, names quietly crossed from census rolls, no investigation noted. Historians now believe the gatherings provided perfect cover for abductions, a convenient chaos that masked something organized and far darker. The market wasn't only selling wives, it was creating supply. The narrator's voice lowers, almost a whisper. How many disappeared without ever being listed? How many were taken, not by a bidder, but by someone in the crowd? The same people who clapped, who drank, who swore it was just tradition. The boundary between amusement and cruelty blurred until no one could tell where it ended. In the evenings when the stalls closed and the streets emptied, the silence that followed was heavier than the noise before. The laughter lingered in the stones, but so did something colder, a sense that the crowd had witnessed too much and felt too little. That was the true horror of the auctions, not the sale itself, but the applause that made it possible. Cruelty doesn't always hide in darkness. Sometimes it dances in daylight, wearing a smile, and when empathy dies, all that's left is the crowd, waiting for the next spectacle, pretending not to see what it has become. By the end of the century, the laughter had started to fade. England was changing. Industry had turned soot into sky, and whispers of reform reached even the smallest towns. But some traditions die harder than sin. In the summer of 1887, in a market town near Somerset, one final auction was held, the last recorded in history. There were no musicians this time, no banners, only a thinning crowd drawn by rumor. They said a man had come to sell his wife the old way, to prove that the world hadn't changed as much as it thought. The husband was a coal worker, his face grey with dust and ale. His wife was small, quiet, her hair tied back, a simple shawl covering her shoulders. The rope was looped around her wrist, not her neck, perhaps an attempt at decency. He stood beside her at the square's edge, shouting for bids while the crowd murmured uncertainly. Some laughed, others watched in silence. A few jeered that the law would come for him, but he grinned, lifting his mug, saying it wasn't a crime, only tradition. Then, through the haze of noise, a woman's voice rose from the crowd. It was clear, strong, and steady. Not today. The voice belonged to one of the early suffragists, part of a small group that had traveled from London to protest. They carried banners, worn and fraying, with words barely legible. "Women are not for sale." The market fell quiet. The husband's smirk faltered. A constable stepped forward, uneasy. For a moment, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Witnesses say the man dropped the rope, muttering curses, and pushed through the onlookers toward the tavern. His wife stood alone, blinking under the afternoon sun, unsure whether to follow or flee. No one came to her. The crowd drifted away, uncertain whether they had just seen history end or simply pause. The magistrate later dismissed the case, calling it a misunderstanding of old custom. The man walked free. The newspapers covered the event with amusement, calling it the final echo of a quaint English practice. No mention was made of the wife's name, only that she was young and unremarkable. Weeks later, a maid in a nearby lodging house found her body hanging from a beam, the rope still wrapped around her wrist. The coroner wrote only 2 words beside her name: no foul play. But some say that night, the suffragists gathered at her grave and lit a candle, promising that her silence would not be the last. As the narrator's voice softens, we see the empty square, the wind sweeping through it like breath through a tomb. The stalls are gone, the stones washed by rain, but if you listen closely, the air still carries the faint echo of a gavel falling, not a judge's, but a market's. The last sound before history closed its eyes. The crowd went home, but the silence stayed, and that silence has never stopped speaking. The old markets are gone now. The wooden platforms rotted away, the cobblestones cleaned, the ledgers tucked behind glass in quiet museums. But the story didn't end there. It only learned to hide better. The rope became invisible. The crowd moved online. The auction never truly stopped. It just changed its stage. Today they call it opportunity, they call it choice, but the words sound familiar, don't they? Men still search for wives they can order, women still vanish after being promised a new beginning. Only now the bids are made through screens. The price is converted into currency the world doesn't question. The same hunger remains. To own, to control, to buy affection and call it love. What once echoed through market squares now hums through fiber optics, just as cold, just as human. Historians trace the parallels easily. The same documents that listed wives by name and condition mirror the profiles that rank beauty, obedience, and suitability. The same laughter that filled the squares now echoes through comment sections and private forums. It is the same voice of entitlement, centuries old, still asking what a woman is worth, and never asking why he needs to know. Some of the new traders don't even see themselves as such. They hide behind algorithms and apps, behind industries dressed as romance. The digital markets are sleek now, polished with convenience and consent. But beneath the surface, the same bargain whispers submission for safety, silence for belonging, ownership for love. The old rope has turned into code. The gavel now clicks like a mouse. The narrator's tone softens, almost mournful. We have built towers from the same wood that once made platforms. We have paved over the markets, but not the mindset. The crowd still gathers, only quieter, hidden behind screens, behind polite words and smiling faces. The applause still comes, likes, follows, payments, every cheer, another echo of the same cruelty that once filled the air of English squares. Archival photos fade into modern footage. A warehouse in Manila, a border crossing in Eastern Europe, a hotel room in Dubai. Each scene different, yet each the same. Faces turned away, names erased, promises rewritten. When did the market ever end? The narrator lets the question hang, heavy and still. Because the answer isn't written in history books. It's written in the spaces where empathy should be. It's written every time someone forgets that people are not possessions. Some chains leave marks on skin, others wrap themselves around the soul. As the screen fades to black, the voice drops to a whisper. The market never closed, it just moved inside us, quieter, colder, waiting for someone brave enough to stop the bidding.